I'm Natalie Sonnen, Director of Life Canada. I want to quickly tell you a little bit about Life Canada. Sometimes we get lost a little bit amongst all the other pro-life organizations, and some people will say to us, there's so many pro-life organizations. We are the national educational organization, so we're sort of the umbrella group, and under us are 70 smaller, either provincial or local pro-life organizations that affiliate with us. So we exist to provide programming, campaigns, national polls, and training to these local groups. So oftentimes we are not working in the big cities like Toronto and Calgary and Vancouver, but we're up in Smithers, and we're in North Bay, and we're in all these tiny little regions around Canada, helping local groups to function better and to better reach their communities. So one of the things we do, alongside our training, so we do training in organizational health and clarity, we do fundraising training and things like that for our groups. We also provide them with programs. And the programs and the national campaigns that we put together for our groups are very often things that they could not do on their own because the budget is just too big. So what we do is we design the entire campaign from start to finish. That might include all kinds of things like posters and radio spots and videos and websites, and then we just pass it off to the groups and they implement it in their community. So that might be putting up billboards, taking out radio spots, sending out the link to the website, and they pretty much can assume that campaign or program as their own. So that's keeps us busy. The other big thing we do is the national polling, and that information goes out to all the groups in Canada. And I was telling my little group at the back in the last session, oftentimes the national organizations are using polling data that is our polling. So we will work with a Environics or Angus Reid Forum or Public Square Research, and we will commission polls and ask very key questions of the Canadian public on both the abortion issue and the euthanasia issue, and we make that information available to the groups, and they use that in all kinds of capacities. As an example, National Campus Life Network has a campaign right now called the Bloody Sexism Project, and their statistic that 98% of Canadians want to see sex selection abortion criminalized. They reject sex selection abortion. That is our polling. So oftentimes we don't get the credit for it because it goes out there, and you don't want to be quoting the pro-life organization. You want to quote the polling group that we commissioned. Nevertheless, I'm sure Kathy Wagenthal and some of the other MPs as well have used our polling data. So, and it's expensive, and we're very grateful for the donors that support Life Canada that help us to commission these polls are usually between $8,000 and $16,000. They're very expensive. So on to the Die and Heal program. So this came in the wake of the legalization or the legislation that brought in both euthanasia and assisted suicide in Canada. There was a presentation yesterday with Blaise Aline, which was absolutely fantastic. If you did not see it, I recommend that you go to our website. We'll have all these presentations available for the public. I would really recommend seeing Blaise's presentation, very articulate and right on the mark in terms of what we're doing with the Die and Heal program. Ours is a little bit more practical, and I'm going to lay that out for you right now. So when the legalization of euthanasia happened, the Supreme Court overturned in a 9-0 decision and then brought it to the legislature, and they put into practice what the Supreme Court had dictated. So it really makes a difference that there's both euthanasia and assisted suicide legalized. In terms of what Blaise was talking about yesterday, it doesn't. Morally, they're equivalent. They're both morally bad, horrible, in every way, so that morally speaking they're equivalent, but practically speaking, it's very interesting. There's no state in the United States that's actually legalized euthanasia. And I don't think there's a country in Europe that's actually legalized euthanasia. It's physician-assisted suicide. And the difference is that with physician-assisted suicide, the doctor prescribes and gives the fatal dose to the patient, who then can decide whether or not to take it on their own, right? With euthanasia, I think Holland has euthanasia, and I think they have for quite a while. There's, what's that, Alex?
Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg.
Thank you. Yes, those three. With euthanasia, there's a deadline, right? There's the important guy in the white, or the girl, lady, in her white smock with her stethoscope and her flip chart, and she's waiting at a certain time and at a certain hour. And Blaise was quoting Dr. Henry Chochinov quite a bit yesterday, and he's looked into this, and he says that euthanasia deaths are 10-fold higher than assisted suicide because of the ambivalence, right? Because the patient feels like they can't withdraw at the last minute. Too much has gone into getting them to where they are now, so even if they don't want to die, they will actually go through with it. So it's 10-fold higher, which is why in Canada, one of the reasons anyway, our stats are kind of through the roof. We've had over 8,000 euthanasia or assisted suicide deaths since legalization in 2016. So really shocking statistics in Canada. So it was with all that in mind that we wanted to tackle this issue. We look at both the abortion issue as well as the beginning and end of life. And partly we wanted to do this in a holistic kind of way. I personally felt exhausted because you feel like you've been fighting the abortion issue and you come up with this campaign and that campaign and you work so hard, and then you get blindsided by another big issue. And I think there was a certain sense of fatigue and just really feeling like, oh boy, how are we going to start petitions again? Are we going to stand on the streets with our placards? What are we going to do here? And we decided to do something that was very one-on-one. And I think it was somebody yesterday was speaking about how important it is to work one-on-one, one soul at a time in this issue. And when you think of it in those terms, it suddenly becomes manageable. And so we put the Dying Healed program together. Oh, this is just a little bit of humor here. He's saying here, so you didn't get to die with dignity. Who does? I choked to death on a bag of marshmallows while sitting in a bath full of hot chocolate. I just thought that was, you gotta have a bit of humor when you're talking about these issues. And then this is just a beautiful quote to start off this talk. Death cannot be the enemy if it's death that brings us to life. For just as without leave-taking, there can be no arrival. Without growing old, there can be no growing up. Without tears, no laughter. So without death, there can be no living. And I think we have heard that theme before. So this is the why of the Dying Healed program. So there were a couple of things that we wanted to do. First of all, what we felt, and through our polling actually, what we saw is that Canadians are concerned about this issue. There was significant polling done by the Death with Dignity crowd, and they came out with these big statistics. 86% of Canadians support choice at end of life. Well, they might if you ask it in a certain way, but when you start to ask questions about, are you concerned for conscience rights? Are you concerned about abuse? Are you concerned about elders who might be forced into situations? Then you start to see a different picture. You start to see that the Canadian public actually are very concerned about this issue. And so we wanted to give people a language and a comfort with talking about this issue. We wanted to give them formation. One of the things we found is that there's great confusion out there about cessation of extraordinary care. There's confusion about the difference between palliative care and assisted suicide. They kind of sound like the same thing maybe, or medical aid in dying, that sounds like palliative care. Euthanasia, all these things. So we wanted to really start to give a formation in the philosophy of end-of-life issues, and we wanted to create permanent visitation programs across Canada. So we wanted this to be systematic. This is the key word in the Die and Heal program, is that it's something that is systematic. And we also, again, to provide meaningful programs to our member groups. So that is sort of the why. So, you know, in terms of how we broached the subject of the Die and Heal program, oftentimes in our work with communities, perhaps maybe a little bit more so in some areas than others, sometimes in the church, there's a fear of getting into these issues too deeply. People are a little afraid of being too intellectual. They're afraid of getting into some of the deeper philosophical questions around death and dying. And so we wanted to tackle this as well. In researching this program, we drew on some giants, right? We are standing on the shoulders of giants, so we quote Viktor Frankl a lot, and Blaise concurs with using Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. We look at some of the stuff that Jordan Peterson says. He's quite interesting in many ways when he talks about issues around suffering. Carol Houselander, she's a famous psychologist and a mystic. She was considered a mystic, and she worked with soldiers coming back from the Second World War. And she has some very interesting things to say. And we looked at both Protestant thinkers and Catholic thinkers, and we looked at the issue both from a humanistic perspective and from a faith-based perspective. So we kind of wanted to cover all the grounds. So Edith Schaeffer and some other Protestant thinkers as well. So we really want to give people a formation in end-of-life issues so they can very clearly think about this issue and have confidence in this issue. And like I said, we wanted this to be systematic and easily repeatable. So we put together a program. We have a manual, so it's sort of like a teacher's manual, and then we have like the student's workbook with the fill in the blanks and the little spaces where you can write down your thoughts and the discussion questions. And we put it into this format. And the idea is that we would train facilitators to then go out across the country and train volunteers. So the idea is not to have me or Anastasia Bowles running around with our heads cut off, like chickens with their heads cut off, all over the country making presentations, but that we would, from a central point, train facilitators who would be very familiar with the manual, which had all of the information, who could then give presentations to smaller groups. And that from these smaller groups, it wouldn't just be a coming together of people to learn, but they would actually form visitation groups. So they would continue then to meet regularly and go out into their community to visit the lonely, the sick, the dying, the suffering, and to actually make a concrete difference. So how we describe the Die and Heal program is a volunteer recruitment program. So we're recruiting volunteers. And we've found this to be very successful. There's a lot of people out there when we started doing this work that have said, yeah, you know, I've really wanted to do this, but I haven't had nobody's kind of kick-started me, nobody's come to me and given me the opportunity. And so that's what we're doing, is we're giving people who've always thought about, you know, I'd really love to go to the long-term care facility just down the road there and sign up and volunteer, but I'm kind of nervous and I don't quite know how to do it. And now you introduce the euthanasia issue and it makes people even more uncomfortable. So this is the whole idea, is recruiting volunteers. The other thing that I wanted to mention is when I did some work many years ago with Oregon, where I looked at a lot of the government documents when they were studying their own outcomes from their own assisted suicide legislation. And some of the things that they admitted to was quite remarkable, and the one thing that really struck me was what they called shepherding, that the Dying with Dignity crowd would actually shepherd people who were isolated, who were vulnerable, who were lonely, who were sick, suffering, they were dying, and they would come to these people and offer assisted suicide and shepherd them. So the word shepherding meant that they would take them away from the caregivers who really cared about them and who really knew them, and guide them off to their own doctors who would give them the quick fix of an easy death. And so this was happening because they were putting their people out into the care facilities, the long-term care facilities, the hospices. They were sending out their volunteers. So again, that was another impetus for this program, that we need to be out there doing the same thing and making sure we're getting our people out there, visiting the lonely, identifying those who are vulnerable to the notion now of assisted suicide and euthanasia in our culture, and giving them hope, just like what Blaise was talking about yesterday. So the idea is that this is very much a compassionate response to the tragic decision of our lawmakers to allow both assisted suicide and euthanasia into Canada. So the idea, why did we use the term dying healed? It sounds like an oxymoron, when in fact, that is really the whole point, right? We cannot heal people physically. We have to come to terms with our own mortality. Every one of us will face death. But we can heal people psychologically, emotionally, and we can help lay people to be confident in this fact, that lay people can go out into the community and one-on-one really make a difference. Anastasia's going to speak following me just now and give some of the concrete examples of how quickly this program has affected communities and individuals in those communities. Dying for lack of love. There was one of the studies we quote in the program is this National Institute of Health study that looked, it was a US team that went to the Netherlands and reported back that it was 68% of the euthanasia deaths that they had witnessed or worked with in the Netherlands. 68% claimed social isolation as the leading factor for wanting to end their lives. So these are really serious issues. I think loneliness is an epidemic in our culture, and I think there's a great need for people to go out and spend time with the sick, suffering, and dying. And we're finding that it really taps into a whole group of people in our culture, namely the retired people that have time on their hands, and they seem to really, really like this program and take it on and have gone out and been working hard and getting into the communities. Why is the Dying Healed program unique? So my colleague Anastasia, when we started out doing this program, we looked at other programs across Canada. In fact, Anastasia did a 9-week course. Anastasia, was it 9 weeks? 10-week course. And so we were kind of getting familiar with other programs out there because there are a lot of volunteer programs. But what we found is that they didn't get into the nitty-gritty. So they didn't want to talk about euthanasia and assisted suicide, either because they've been running these programs for a long time and they were just continuing to run them even though the law had changed and they didn't want to deal with it, or because the law had changed, they were now on board and they were promoting these practices. So they didn't want to deal head-on with the issues of euthanasia and assisted suicide, nor did they address the issue of suffering. And that's one of the key things that the program does, is it really talks about the whole idea of human suffering, and that our suffering has purpose and meaning. And that's what Blaise touched on yesterday as well. So we have stuff about the process, the how to walk into a room, how to, active listening. We get into all of that, but before we do, we go through a whole formation of what these practices are and what is the meaning and purpose of human suffering. And so we wanted to really put that content back into the program. So some of the key concepts of the Dying Healed program is basically because our culture often equates happiness with material possession and pleasure, we have a hard time coming to terms with suffering and sympathize with the idea of euthanasia and assisted suicide. So we talk about the transcendent nature of the human person and how the person can transcend the material world and how there's deeper things at work like love and goodness and justice that the person can live for that has nothing to do with their material well-being. So we get into those kinds of discussions and we introduce some language that they may not be familiar with, but we're pushing the envelope a little bit. So the word transcendent often sounds, we think of yogis, you know, when we think of transcendent. We don't mean it in that term. In that way, we're talking about the philosophical notion of the transcendent nature of the human person. So we bring those issues to the forefront. And we talk about the power of human presence, how important it is that we are with the lonely and the suffering and the dying, and what your presence can do to change the life of somebody who is alone. And again, Anastasia will speak to those. And I've had experiences where just a weekly meeting for somebody who is suffering social isolation can mean the world to them and completely change their life around. So this is really important work. So what does the Dying Healed not do? We do not replace any other volunteer program. So we are pre-training, so we kind of consider this pre-training. We're not training professional counselors, we're not training advisors or people to go up and be confrontational with medical staff or to proselytize. This is really, truly giving people confidence and giving them the power. We're empowering people to go and approach institutions or approach their parish and start up a pastoral visitation program within their church community and to get out there and to be with the lonely and the vulnerable. How's my time? Anybody keeping track of me? Because I could go on and on. I'll very quickly, you could flash a 5 at me if I'm coming to the end. Very quickly, I'm going to just give you a quick overview. So we start out with definitions, a little dry, but very necessary, especially in our culture where language gets bantered around and oftentimes co-opted by the other side, by the Dying with Dignity crowd. So active versus passive euthanasia, what is that? Euthanasia versus assisted suicide, what is that? Palliative care, what do we mean by pain management? And then we talk about the ins and outs of disproportionate and proportionate treatment and what is the intention when you withdraw medical aid from somebody and thus that leads to their death. Is that ethical or unethical? And there's some interesting situations and people get very confused here, and we need to make sure people are very clear. Then we go into this more philosophical stuff. What is human dignity? We talk about man's transcendent nature. Does the person have to be demonstrating their dignity in order to be protected? And we look at human suffering again, very important point, very important aspect of this program that no other program uses. Suffering, the importance and meaning of human suffering, both from a natural and a humanistic perspective. And finally, we talk very concretely about, some of the what's at stake, the unintended nonverbal messages that are now being conveyed through our medical system through the law. The law is a great teacher. So when the law says something now is okay, that's what our culture, our culture becomes imbued with this, sometimes without even realizing. What are the unintended messages that are getting sort of transmitted through the culture? And then I talked about the difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide, the tenfold rise in deaths when it's euthanasia, and Canada has both. And then we go into the pastoral aspects. This is the how-to, what to expect when volunteering, nonverbal behavior, active listening, spiritual care. So we really encourage people to be aware of the transcendent and to really acknowledge that when they are visiting. You don't have to be coming from a particular faith background, but you should, in virtue, it's the right of the suffering to know that they have a transcendent nature, and that to reach out to God is a normal human thing, and we should acknowledge that. And then we go through a whole bunch of case studies, and we do small group discussions and all that stuff. So we also just finally, we help people determine what is the right fit for them in terms of, now that you have this information and you feel empowered and you feel inspired, do you want to just do this with your relatives? You've got a sick relative. Is this how it's, where you're going to use this? Are you going to do a church-based group? Is this going to be through an institution? And if it's through an institution, you do have to undergo the training of the institution. But now you can do so with a bit of confidence and knowledge and formation. And then follow-up. So we usually like to follow up with every group that we train to make sure that their needs are being met, that they have whatever their needs might be in terms of questions answered, but also to know what they're doing so we can kind of keep score. We also have a marketing campaign, so we have all kinds of things. These are web advertising. We have little video vignettes for people to use when they're advertising, and posters. So each one of these is encouraging the community to get involved and to get out there and spend time with the lowly. So an hour streaming a movie you will forget, or an hour with him you won't forget. Okay? So now I'm going to turn it over to Anastasia.
I was privileged to be accompanying my mother on her own journey through illness and her subsequent death. And I use the term privileged because I learned so much from that experience. So even though it was a painful experience, I learned a great deal from it. And I'm from a big Catholic family, 12 living siblings. And so as a consequence, my mom was never really alone, and we took shifts with her. And in fact, it got to the point that they actually started posting signs around the hospital saying only so many visitors at a time, because we were too many of us in a room at one time. So my mom was fortunate. She had all of us, but not everybody has someone. A lot of people are alone. And I remember just after my mom died, I turned to my sisters and I said, nobody should go through that experience alone. Because death, dying, illness, these are not things that we should endure in isolation. And I'm not just talking about the patient. I'm talking about the family members as well. We need support. So that experience, along with the Dying Healed program, which is excellent, little plug there, helped prompt me to begin volunteering at a palliative care unit in an inner city hospital. And the more time I spend volunteering, the more I see a tremendous need for others to do the same, especially in end-of-life care and long-term care. And again, not just for the patients, for the volunteers as well. And you hear volunteers say it all the time, oh, I get so much more than I give. And it's so true. There's a line from my favorite, what is it, it's Francis of Assisi, for it is in giving that we receive. And you hear volunteers say that all the time, so it's a reciprocal relationship. So I'm just going to skip through some of this because I know we're a little tight for time. You've already heard about court access to quality palliative care. I'm just very briefly going to say what palliative care is because it's kind of important. Palliative care is a very specialized kind of care. So it's not just addressing the physical needs of the patient, it's their emotional, spiritual, psychological needs as well. And as a volunteer, if you are offering support to someone, that's palliative care. The medical side is a medical side, but you're really doing palliative care. So we don't have access to quality palliative care in Canada. I attended a talk with the Director of Maiden Ethics for the Ottawa Hospital, Everybody knows what MAID is. I don't have to explain that. We're all pretty clear. Okay, because this is another thing I can skip. So I attended this talk, and there was a palliative care physician there who was actually in favor of medical aid in dying. And many are not, most are not. In fact, they're actually trying to remove medical aid in dying from the palliative care profession. They want to keep it separate. But this palliative care physician was in favor of medical aid in dying, and yet she still had concerns. She said she was concerned because they're flying MAID teams to remote communities in Canada where they don't have access to quality palliative care. So in other words, money is being spent to kill people instead of being spent on caring for them. I have a big problem with that. A 2016 study Natalie was already talking about indicated that loneliness was a factor. I think I have my stat wrong there.
Maybe I have mine wrong.
So loneliness is a factor in why people request euthanasia and assisted suicide. Mother Teresa, who spent her life serving the poorest of the poor in some of the world's most destitute nations, said loneliness is the greatest poverty. And so here she's not talking about food, water, she's talking about loneliness. And the Dying Healed program takes that a step further and says our culture's dying for lack of love. And now report after report is demonstrating how loneliness actually contributes to physical health problems. So a recent report by the American Psychological Association said that loneliness is linked to a whole slew of physical health problems and up to an 84% increased risk of an early death. So the problem is compounded. Loneliness causes physical health problems. Being physically unwell causes loneliness. And now we're seeing suicide, loneliness linked to suicide, even in the young. And now euthanasia being thrown into the mix. So we're seeing more and more people being euthanized in the Netherlands for things like depression. I think if Alex is around, there's a 23-year-old perfectly healthy with depression that they're now considering euthanizing. In Belgium. He knows all the countries. Okay, so people are being euthanized for depression in those countries, and Canada will not be far behind. Those with long-term and terminal illnesses are especially vulnerable because hospital stays further isolate people, right? And I've seen many patients that are in the hospital where I'm volunteering, and their closest loved one is in another hospital, sick and dying. So they've lost their support unit, and they can't visit with them. I have one patient I remember saying, I just want someone to eat lunch with me. You know, this creature comfort that we all take for granted, and how easy it would be for us to make a difference. And a couple of weeks ago, I had to share this. So there was an older lady I was visiting, a real spitfire. She said, I'm 96 or 97, I can't remember. And it was like she knew I was going to be talking to you because she started talking about aging and loneliness. And she said, you know, it's so much worse in the hospital. She said, you just want someone to talk to. And younger people, I find, younger patients, they say, I'm bored, which I see as a euphemism for loneliness and isolation. So if you don't have access to proper care, and if you're feeling lonely and isolated and depressed, and if it's legal and championed and even promoted in our culture, then it's little surprise that euthanasia and assisted suicide are seen as viable options. So I sometimes volunteer on a long-term care floor, and these are the people who are the most vulnerable. These are the people who are at risk. There's one fellow when I walk by the room, and he has dementia, a lot of them do, and he's always ha 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 laughing and hello, hello, hello. So I always stop, poke my head in and say hello, so-and-so, you know, and then I walk away and I have to go see someone else and I can still hear him, hello, hello, to the next person. And there was one time where I was walking along and there was a woman in a wheelchair and I stopped to talk to her and she grabbed my hand and she, you know, and after a while, you know, I literally had to pry my hand away and walk away and leave her alone. When I come off the elevator, the doors open and there's a line of people sitting there waiting for someone to talk to them or something to happen. So these people are suffering silently and needlessly, and it's up to us, to you and I, to make a difference. So those people are not eligible for euthanasia yet, but they soon will be. Our government has already talked about relaxing restrictions on euthanasia, removing, I think the Quebec court has just recently removed, again, Alex, the verifier in the back, fact checker, removing terminal illness as a criteria. So people with dementia will be at risk. In the Netherlands, they're euthanizing healthy people with depression and dementia. And Canada will surely be doing the same in the very near future if we don't speak out. So we need pro-lifers to take an active stand on this issue politically. But we also need advocacy and education, and that's where the Dying Healed program comes in. With its focus on the concept that your presence at the bedside of the lonely and disabled can make a difference. It especially explores the transformative power of human presence. And I'll just leave the quote here because I know we're tight for time. Where's Cam? He's not around, so he's not letting me, okay. So we're good. So our presence can affirm human dignity of others. But it's a reciprocal relationship. Because as we affirm someone else's dignity, our own dignity is affirmed. So it's back to that, we get more than we give. Now, dignity, it's become such a social construct, it's such an elusive term. Like, what is dignity? And our society typically associates dignity with a certain quality of life, certain characteristics. So things like continence, mobility, independence. Well, guess what? On a palliative care floor, there's not a lot of that. So I often use in the Dying Healed workshops the example of a newborn. A newborn is fully dependent. They're incontinent, and they are immobile. Yet we wouldn't say they lack dignity. And so why, if it's okay in the early stages of life, why do we say that in the later stages they lack dignity? The only difference, I would say, is hope. And we have to think of the message that we're sending to those with disabilities who may have issues of immobility or incontinence. Are we saying that they lack dignity, that they lack value? So what is missing for the people that I visit is absolutely not their dignity. What is missing is more people to affirm their dignity. What is missing is what I would say is love. So can we really make a difference? Well, I had a call one day from a woman who had attended one of our workshops, and she was quite distressed, and she said one of her relatives was terminally ill and was on the list for medical aid in dying, or was going through the process. And the family was very upset, Catholic family, and we have to think about this too, right? The impact on the family members. And this came up in the Director of MAID and Ethics talk that I attended, that the families are often quite devastated. They don't have a say. And there's the reverse side of that, where the patient makes the family member is pressuring, and then the patient is feeling obligated. And so, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. The family was devastated. And we also have to think about the message that we're sending to young people. When we say that suicide, sometimes if you're not feeling great, it's okay. Suicide is never okay. Euthanasia is never okay. And so we talked to this woman, gave her some advice, and then referred her to Alex at the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and he talked to her. And then the family gathered, rallied around him, offered him support, and in the end, he reversed his decision, changed his mind. And he ended up dying a natural death, had his last rites. So it's truly soul-saving work, and that's where being a comforting human presence can make a profound difference. But it's rarely that dramatic. So our workshops emphasize that we can simply bring hope, not knowing the reverberations that will bring. I remember one patient telling me she was lying on the hospital bed, riddled with cancer, and she looks up at me with tears in her eyes and she says, "They keep offering me MAID, and I don't want it. It's not my faith." And so As a volunteer, I have to be really, really careful what I say, and the Dying Healed program helps walk through situations like that. And so I went into the kitchen, in the hospital kitchen, and I found some flowers, and I put them by her bedside, and I said, when you're feeling lonely and depressed, just look at those and know that somebody cares. And I like to think that maybe that helped, gave her a bit of hope. And she did end up dying not long later, maybe a couple weeks later, a natural death. So more and more, we are witnessing a culture that is losing hope, and it's up to us to restore it. And in the Dying Healed manual, it quotes the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, which says, hope can be as simple and as profound as another human being who appears to hear our fear. Fear is a big motivator in requests for euthanasia and assisted suicide. When despair seems to overcome us, we feel disconnected, isolated, lost. What we need most in those moments is a sense of reconnection, relationship, and belonging. So whether you're terminally ill or not, hope is the antidote to despair. And that human connection is so powerful and healing. We absolutely crave it. It's part of who we are as human beings. I remember one of my very first weeks volunteering, I went by a room and there was an older woman sitting there in her bed, and I went in and I sat down and started talking to her, and she grabbed my hand. It's amazing how many grabbed your hand. And I've actually had a couple of people kiss it too, which is really amazing. And she said, thank you so much for volunteering. And she started telling me about how she used to be a volunteer. And these are people, they're human beings with lives, laughs, stories to share. They're not just undignified people to be eliminated. So I went by, I eventually left her room, and I went by the next week, and she wasn't there. So I checked, they had a deaths and discharges book, and I checked, and she had just died a few hours after our conversation. And so I can't tell you how humbling and moving it is to know that you are one of the last people to comfort somebody, to literally hold the hand of somebody, a stranger, who is alone and dying. We don't know the difference that we can make. And I'm not talking about the difference that I made in her life, right? I'm talking about the difference that she made in mine, a profound impact. And hopefully on you here today. Like, I hope you're hearing my message here. So she could never have known in those last few hours of her life that she was going to impact someone and make a difference profoundly. And she did. So most of what I do in a palliative care unit or in the hospital as a volunteer is just really little things, getting a glass of water, a warm blanket for somebody or something. And the Dying Healed program walks through what to expect. But Mother Teresa said we're not asked to do great things. We're not called to do great things. We're called to do small things with great love. So those little acts of kindness and compassion are like pebbles in a pond, the lasting ripple effect. We're part of a social fabric. Our decisions affect everyone. What we do affects everyone. I remember a priest once saying, it doesn't matter what you say, it only matters that you are there. So I just want to close Kim, with a quote that's in the Dying Healed program, full of wonderful quotes. Have I plugged it enough? That says, from Reverend Danielson, chaplain and founder of Spiritual Care Support Ministries, the best gift we can give to the chronically ill is our time. We need to talk less and be present more. And I always close with that because that means I'm going to talk less and be present more. So, thank you. One more plug, the Dying Healed workshop next week. If I've motivated you to volunteer, here's a perfect opportunity to sign up.